Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Lisa Keeney, and I am an alumna of the University of Michigan's School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and I currently serve as an editorial assistant for the George and Ira Gershwin Initiative. Joining me to discuss the orchestral saxophone in the works of Gershwin and Adams is Dr. Timothy McAllister, the professor of saxophone at the University of Michigan. In addition to being the featured soloist of the Adams Concerto, Dr. McAllister has also been a frequent guest with ensembles such as the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. It's a special treat to introduce him to you, especially as a graduate of the saxophone studio at Michigan. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin with a general question.
Sure.
What is the orchestral saxophone, and why is it considered as an anomaly or a specialty instrument in orchestral music?
Well, it's such a complicated past that we have with the saxophone. Obviously, being an invented instrument, it took a long time to catch on, but it was mired in a lot of political upheaval there in Paris with Adolphe Sax himself. I mean, he was either a very heavily supported figure or a heavily disliked figure, depending on who you talked with. So when we think of what he had to endure to get his instruments adopted by ensembles, it's quite amazing that we're here to talk about it at all, because the saxophone really had a lot of resistance. Almost all of those instruments, when we think about the climate of the 19th century, the evolution of the orchestra itself, the increasing size, the experimentation with instruments, the evolution of brass winds, woodwinds, the improvement of woodwinds, the gaining scope of the symphony orchestra timbre, and even the larger forces that we saw in the percussion section or in the brass. It was really quite a time of change, and maybe it was perfect for him to introduce this instrument. The military musicians had no choice, because it was decreed that the military bands would use the saxophones, but all of Adolphe Sax's instruments. So that also includes the sax horns, that includes all of the modified instruments.
Like the bass clarinet.
Yeah, absolutely, all of his modified instruments. The improved valve systems, for instance, and how that affected the evolution of brass instruments. But even just the introduction of other kinds of exotic instruments, such as Wagner tubas, this was a very interesting period. So I think with the orchestra, it's an anomaly for many reasons. The political side of it, the political troubles with Adolphe Sax, Monsieur Sax. Economics certainly played into this as well. You had to hire other musicians, specialists on these new instruments. There was no pedagogy that allowed necessarily for instrumentalists of that time to simply pick up the saxophone. You had to get to the source. You had to go to Adolphe Sax himself for his instruction. This is why there was a position created for him at the Paris Conservatoire at the time. And then just maybe a lack of understanding of what the saxophone could be. And of course, Berlioz is one of those figures that really was a great champion for the instrument, writes about it in his treatise on orchestration and instrumentation. But he always saw the instrument as this symbol of melancholy, this sound, this somber sound, this deep timbre, this soulful quality that he heard in those instruments. And I think as a result, composers were really curious or maybe stupefied about how they were going to use it. And so it takes a while, I think, for there to be an identity for how saxophone can be used in the orchestra.
And going along that, how does this identity make its way into the orchestral pieces that include the saxophone, such as the Mussorgsky and Ravel's Pictures at an Exhibition?
Well, it really starts before that. We look at Vincent d'Indy. He writes for several saxophones in a work from 1897. Also, at the same time with other figures like George Kastner, and then we move into 1904 with Richard Strauss's use of saxophones in the Sinfonia Domestica. So the saxophone is seen as a family of instruments before it's thought of as a solo instrument. That leads to the beginnings of the saxophone as a featured instrument within the orchestra. So I think at first, those early examples, the saxophone's embedded within a larger orchestral texture and seen as becoming what Adolphe Sax had in mind was either being a reinforcement of the woodwind sound or a glue between the woodwinds and the brass. That's all well documented about how he wanted the saxophone to be viewed. But it's interesting that little by little, the saxophone's use starts to move away from a choir or an ensemble within the orchestral medium to simply a single player, a single soloist. So that doesn't start until the 20s and 30s, and that's when, in many ways, I think this is an interesting time because the level of playing that was required and the higher profile that was put upon those solo moments, whether it was Ravel's use in his orchestration of Pictures at an Exhibition, or Rachmaninoff using it in 1941 and 1940 with the symphonic dances, suddenly the stakes were higher. The quality of the playing needed to be, in effect, better. And I think there were some, well, we know there were amazing musicians playing saxophone, but they also were amazing musicians on other instruments. They were bringing the quality that they understood that existed in the pedagogy of other instruments like clarinet or even something like violin. Bringing that to the saxophone allowed for them to have some sense of standards. But it's possible that along the way, when people were being called upon to maybe play the saxophone, to pick it up, maybe it was an auxiliary clarinet player or an auxiliary bassoon player, to suddenly play the saxophone, it's very possible there became a lack of training in the instrument. And you started to see maybe performances that didn't really stack up in the quality of the woodwind section. When we're talking about orchestral woodwind sections of the Philadelphia Orchestra or any orchestra in Europe essentially, and New York Philharmonic and all of that, the quality of playing in that ensemble had been set for a long time. So for the saxophone to come along as an interloper and for someone to not have training on that instrument as at the same level, in many ways, in my opinion, doomed the instrument in those years. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting that composers were using saxophone in relative extremes. You had maybe one camp of composers that were deciding that the saxophone was this embodiment of the bourgeois or the embodiment of the everyman, mm-hmm. the music of the streets, which might often be associated with urban music of the time, maybe dance music of the time, music of the emerging culture of burlesque and cabaret. There were composers that were seeing the saxophone as a deviant sound, a deviant instrument as well. But you had composers that were also championing the instrument as this incredibly gorgeous voice-like instrument, the way Rachmaninoff used it. And in fact, Rachmaninoff really modeling that solo based on the playing or practices of Larry Teal, who got to play it in Philadelphia after Rachmaninoff's visit to Ann Arbor. And so there's a wonderful tradition there, but when we go all the way back to the 20s and maybe the late teens, the way composers like George Gershwin now were seeing the saxophone as the embodiment or emblematic of dance band music, the beginnings of dance band, or the codification, if you will, of the dance band ensemble as a true medium. So it's either going to be a solo classical sound, or it's going to be using the saxophone to emulate these early jazz bands. Mm-hmm. And that's what leads to a piece like American in Paris, or the way Gershwin used it in Rhapsody in Blue.
Right. So Rhapsody in Blue, like, legitimately takes the dance band and the jazz band sound in his original version of it, orchestrated by Ferdi Grofé, by the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, which had 3 wind players playing multiple saxophones. Whereas in American in Paris, he takes that same sort of idea within the full orchestra, taking 3 saxophone players and giving them doubling instruments, as we will see in this premiere version of the unabridged version of An American in Paris. So in this general progression of the saxophone in the orchestral repertoire, what kind of role does George Gershwin and his music play for the saxophone?
Well, he certainly puts this emerging popularity of the dance band or this early jazz band, he certainly puts that front and center. This is going to be fused into a modern orchestral society. That puts upon us as players and the use of the saxophone to certainly be more in the jazz vein, or in this post-vaudeville era style. This is a departure from how Bizet would use it or how Ravel saw it, and it's asking almost, at the time, exclusively, it's asking the American Society of Saxophone Players or redoublers who are playing saxophone, it's asking of them a sensibility to play in that style, to understand maybe more of a jazz sound, to fit in or look at a trio of saxophone players as having a similar blend to a 3-person woodwind front in the dance band. So that is different. That's very different than the idea of the saxophone section as an extension of the military band saxophone choir, the way Gustav Holst saw saxophones. I mean, 4 to 6 saxophone players, or the way Percy Grainger would have used it in the band. There's really no reference to the saxophone ensemble within a concert band of the time taking on jazz or dance band stylistic devices, if you will, or color, or just even something like looking at vibrato or glissandi as a part of the sound. So Gershwin starts to really use the saxophone and its role in the orchestra as an example of how orchestral and dance band music is starting to become blurred in his vision of the modern symphony, and that has found its way forward. In some ways, his vision, even though it was predated by a figure such as Darius Milhaud, and how he was reenacting a Harlem dance band with La Christian Dumont. Gershwin comes later, but in many ways it's Gershwin's vision that gets most recognized and utilized.